The thing is with horror cinema, sometimes there's just so much good stuff zipping through those terror-fueled airwaves that more often than not it's incredibly easy to miss all kinds of long-forgotten classics that would otherwise have enriched your life of horror fandom in more ways than you could ever have expected. Early 70s B-movie horror is a little too campy for everyone's taste, but if you're thinking about diving into some of the most well-crafted, long-forgotten classics of horror cinema, the 1972's Horror Express is the film for you. You see, whilst its cultural significance was by no means lost on the majority of die-hard horror fans, the real shame is if this film was produced and released perhaps under a more palatable manner, Horror Express would have received the true recognition it deserves. For a low-budget horror movie though, this film hits hard, and it's down to a pitch-perfect performance by the king of horror himself, the late, great Sir Christopher Lee, who plays a brilliantly convincing British anthropologist stuck on a train filled with frozen ancient aliens and subsequent zombies. Yeah, that's always a winning combination. Written by Arnaud Dosseau and directed by Eugenio Martin, Horror Express tells a tale of Professor Sir Alexander Saxton, played by Lee, who in the year 1906 is travelling on the legendary Trans-Siberian Express from China to Moscow, hauling a crate containing the frozen mummified remains of a strange, primitive, humanoid creature that was discovered in a cave in Manchuria. Yeah, there's obviously a lot of setup to it, but don't worry, because Christopher Lee carries this movie with more wry smirks and authoritative bassy dialogue than his own heavy metal Christmas album, as things quickly go terribly wrong on the most iconic of horror narrative locomotive devices. Come on, everyone loves a train murder mystery slash zombie invasion, right? Horror Express is pure nostalgia, dripping with atmosphere and crammed with some of the greatest character actors in the history of cinema, pinned neatly behind a surprisingly innovative narrative for its time. The fact that it's sadly a bit too dusty for most people's horror collection is a shame, and reason enough for you to pick it up. Coming in at number 4, Burnt Offerings, 1976.
This is hella nice.
And whilst we're on the topic of mysteries, we may as well throw this one onto the campfire, because this particular Burnt Offering, whilst not being anything new or ever groundbreaking in the field of horror cinema, is just a straight up good old fashioned horror movie with perhaps one of the most disturbing endings of many movies of its ilk. And by ilk, I mean haunted house horror, because that's exactly what this film is, and rips many pages out of the likes of 1963's The Haunting. That is probably one of the main reasons as to why this film got so slaughtered by critics, giving it the terrible reputation that it never quite recovered from. Why? I don't know, because this film is worth rediscovering for its cast alone. Oliver Reed and Bette Davis, who knocked this film out of the park as the titans of cinema that they are. You see, the mid to late 70s were a time of shock and awe cinema, but Burnt Offerings is neither of those things. It's a slow burning, atmospheric crawl through a demonic old American mansion that's a little bit predictable in places, with perhaps too many deliberate ghosts in its closet. But the simplicity in its plot is the scaffolding for the most important part of horror content: fear. Because although dated, this film can still summon the creeps through every darkened keyhole and every wilted garden. Written and directed by Dan Curtis, based upon the 1973 novel of the same name by Robert Marasco, Burnt Offerings tells the tale of the Rolfe family, who need a break from their cramped New York apartment and decide to take their summer holiday out in the coastal pleasures of Long Island. Of course, that's the worst possible decision, but we know that, not Oliver Reed and Bette Davis, which makes it all the more worthwhile when the old mansion gradually begins to feast on their flesh and blood, whilst a creepy old lady in the attic hides from the rest of the family. This film got a really bum deal by everyone else, but that doesn't mean that its horror credentials were for nothing. Give it a watch. Next up at number 3, Stir of Echoes, 1999.
What the hell was that?
Kevin Bacon, my man. And truth be told, this film might not be as truly great as it is without Mr. Bacon giving one of his most convincing performances to date, which is also equally crazy that for the most part, 1999's Stir of Echoes is completely overlooked when it comes to contemporary horror. But just like another film that is on this list, it may have to do with a particular syndrome of the late 90s, where a chain of some of the most iconic movies of the last millennium were released in a quick succession before this one, being The Sixth Sense, The Blair Witch Project and The Mummy. Yeah, that's some tough competition. And sadly, that was one of the prime reasons as to why Stir of Echoes got shuffled to the back of the pile. But fear not, because that's why we're here. Written and directed by David Cope, the man responsible for writing the screenplay for Jurassic Park, Stir of Echoes is loosely based upon the 1958 novel of the same name by Richard Matheson, the man also responsible for penning 1954's I Am Legend. Yeah, and as you may already tell, this film's got quite the pedigree behind it. It tells the tale of a man named Tom Witzke, played by Bacon, alongside his wife Maggie and his son Jake, who supposedly possesses the supernatural ability to communicate with the dead. Although Tom is a skeptic of his son's powers, the rest of his family aren't, and so one evening during a party, he jokingly agrees to be hypnotized by Maggie's sister, a true believer of the spirit world. And then, just like that, the echoes within his mind are stirred, and Tom tumbles down a rabbit hole of supernatural intrigue and the callings of a disturbed spirit and her grisly murder. I won't say any more because, like any good horror mystery, the best experience comes with pulling at the thread for yourself. But this film is surprisingly fantastic and well worth a watch. Swinging in at number 2, Dark City, 1998. And I'm in the mood to change things up a bit for this one, because for the most part this entry isn't a horror movie in the traditional sense, and in some ways it isn't a horror movie at all. But I do believe that from a purely visual perspective, 1998's Dark City is a fantastically terrifying mishmash of all things that you top 5 scary viewers enjoy. Now, that's also not to say that this film doesn't hit the mark when it comes to narrative, because holy moly does this movie cover some weighty themes, and I won't say anything to give it away other than the fact that this film was perhaps a cultural precursor to The Matrix. Written and directed by Alex Proyas, the man responsible for the fantastic 1994 dark thriller The Crow, starring Brandon Lee, Dark City is a film of such unfortunate timing that it's no wonder that it was forgotten to the sands of time. And for the most part, it's down to one film. Titanic, released a few months prior, that pretty much washed out any other movie's chance at the box office, particularly a neo-noir stylized gothic science fiction mystery. Yeah, Titanic wasn't the only cause of ships sinking in the late 90s, but that's fine because hindsight is our friend, and now we can truly pay our dues to how damn awesome Dark City truly is. And you'll also be pleased to know that this film is absolutely stacked when it comes to its cast. Kiefer Sutherland, Rufus Sewell, Jennifer Connelly, Richard O'Brien, William Hurt and Ian Richardson, all of which give resounding performances throughout. I really don't want to give away any of the plot points, because the true joy of this film comes with discovering things as the Dark City slowly reveals them. But trust me, this film is awesome. If you were a fan of The Crow or anything that directors like Terry Gilliam have ever produced, then you'll adore Dark City. Give it a watch. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Next of Kin, 1982. And if we're talking about horror credentials, holy moly is this film the true definition of an underrated masterpiece. And it's perhaps one of the most fitting entries on this top 5 list series, because 1982's Next of Kin is so damn good that every horror fan needs to take a look at it just to realise exactly what they were missing. But let's have a brief history lesson first and talk about one of the most intriguing subgenres in cinema, Ozploitation. In Australia, before the period that ran between the early 70s and the late 80s, film culture wasn't exactly the most open and free that it could have been, and expression in film in particular was stemmed by the Australian government, banning pretty much every movie that wouldn't meet their strict censorship standards in a post-World War II society. But then came the new wave, and some of the most batshit crazy horror movies in cinema were born, which is a matter for a whole other video. But the point is, the culmination of all of those things that were learned throughout the Ozploitation era peaked at 1982's Next of Kin. Written and directed by the awesome Tony Williams and starring Jackie Kerin and John Jarrett, as in, yes, that John Jarrett, the guy that plays the terrifying Mick Taylor in Wolf Creek. Next of Kin is pretty much The Shining meets Psycho, with a little pinch of 1980's The Changeling thrown into it. Now, I won't say anything about the plot because there are too many twists and turns in this movie that half the joy of watching it comes with the breathlessness in those sporadic moments where the dial gets turned up to 11. This film is as Australian as it gets, and the final act of this film is even more Australian than that. The cast is fantastic, it's beautifully and vividly shot, it's genuinely terrifying for the most part, and it is one of the most entertaining horror movies ever to come out of Australia. It's a shame that it's often widely forgotten, but give it a watch. You won't be disappointed.
Coming in at 5, I Spit on Your Grave. Released in 1979 and directed by Miyazaki, I Spit on Your Grave is a rape and revenge horror film that tells the story of Jennifer Hills, a writer based in New York City who exacts revenge on each of her tormentors after 4 men gang rape her and leave her for dead. The movie is a violent slice of horror that was unsurprisingly met with fierce opposition upon its release. Critics such as Roger Ebert refer to it as, I quote, a vile bag of garbage without a shred of artistic distinction, and attending it was one of the most depressing experiences of my life. He also went on to call it so sick, reprehensible and contemptible, and he could barely believe it existed. However, it wasn't just movie critics who hated the movie, entire countries did as well. Canada initially banned the film, however they later allowed individual provinces to decide if it would be allowed within their borders during the 1990s. The UK would only allow the movie to be released in censored form, meaning severe cuts, whereas countries such as Norway, Iceland and West Germany at the time banned it outright on the premise that it supported violence against women. However, stranger still, the movie was only banned in Australia 20 years after its release. The ban was rescinded in 2004, however, but not all countries were as lenient, with the film still remaining banned in Ireland to this day. Coming in at 4, Snuff. Released in 1976 and directed by Michael Finley, Snuff is a splatter film that is most notorious for being marketed as if it were an actual snuff film. The plot itself revolves around actress Terry London and her producer Max Marsh, who visit an unnamed country in South America. A female biker cult led by a man named Satan stalks and eventually murders the pregnant London and her circle of friends. The movie is very Manson family-esque before quickly switching gears and becoming a documentary of a young woman being killed by the film's crew. Now, this movie actually has an interesting backstory. Michael Finley went down to Argentina to shoot a quick and dirty movie that would ultimately cash in on the helter-skelter craze, titling it Slaughter. However, the movie was unreleasable, but the then distributor Alan Shackleton had the idea of filming a fake killing, tacking it on the end of the movie and creating rumours that this was the real deal, a real snuff film. So to double down on the urban legend, they renamed the movie Snuff, and then hired fake protesters to picket in front of theatres. It eventually got to the point that the New York's district attorney considered prosecuting a theatre owner who was showing it. However, Variety were the first to expose the movie and its publicity stunts as hoaxes.
This is the true story of 4 innocent young actresses who thought they were making just another movie, but didn't know they were making the ultimate movie.
Coming in at number 3, Traces of Death. Released in 1993 and directed by Damon Fox, Traces of Death is a Z-Movie Mondo shockumentary that consists of various scenes of stock footage depicting death and real scenes of violence. Unlike the movie Faces of Death, which included fake deaths and reenactments, Traces is for the most part real and consists of public domain footage depicting death and injury. As you would expect, the movie was met with rejection all across the globe, and in 2005 the BBFC refused to give the first film an age certificate, effectively banning it. They deemed the movie to have no journalistic, educational or other justifying content for the images shown, while also suggesting that the film could potentially breach the UK laws under the Obscene Publications Act. The entire series has been subject to confiscation by customs authorities in Australia, and according to the country's regulations, I quote, they offend against the standards of morality, decency and propriety generally accepted by reasonable adults to the extent that they should not be imported. Honestly, this film is absolutely disgusting and should never be watched. Coming in at 2, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Released in 1986 and directed by John McNaughton, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is a psychological horror about the random crime spree of a serial killer who seemingly operates with impunity. The film was, as expected, quite controversial. In the UK, the film has had a long and complex relationship with our friends the BBFC, with them refusing certification for many years. Now, the film's production company didn't even want to give the movie a theatrical release, which is a surprise, leaving the director to personally send out screener copies to critics in hopes of drumming up buzz. However, no one was willing, simply because the MPAA gave the movie an X rating, which at the time was mostly reserved for porno films. The film has heavy violence, which actually aided in the creation of the NC-17 rating, a distinction for movies with extreme content that don't quite cross the line into porn. But you may be asking, what happened to the film in Australia and New Zealand? Well, the film was originally outright banned by the film censor in 1992. A censored version was subsequently released on home video with cuts to the family massacre sequence, and was released on DVD in 2005.
Look at the world. It's either you or them. You know what I mean.
And finally coming in at number 1, The Last House on the Left. Released in 1972 and directed by the legendary Wes Craven, Last House on the Left is an exploitation horror film that revolves around 2 teenage girls who were taken into the woods and tortured by a gang of murderous thugs. Now, this movie was actually Craven's directorial debut and was loosely inspired by Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, and in turn received vicious censoring, resulting in it being banned in certain countries for decades. The film was explicit, particularly the torture scene, and therefore the United Kingdom refused a certificate for cinema release by the BBFC in 1974 due to the scenes of sadism and violence. The film was ultimately banned throughout the remainder of the 1980s and into the 1990s. However, after a series of major cuts, the movie is now available for viewing. That itself didn't happen until 2008. To top it off, no one even bothered to attempt to distribute it in Australia due to the monumental problems it would have caused. It actually wasn't even released down under until 2004. How crazy is that? The New York Times critics, Howard Thompson, even admitted to walking out after just 50 minutes of this sickening tripe. Fun fact for you all, when it was no longer banned, my parents bought it for me. Merry Christmas. Coming in at 5, Land of the Dead, 2005. Land of the Dead is a 2005 post-apocalyptic horror movie written and directed by George A. Romero, the 4th of Romero's 6 Living Dead movies. It is preceded by Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. The story deals with the zombie assault on Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where a feudal-like government exists. The survivors in the film have fled to the Golden Triangle area of downtown Pittsburgh. The region is protected on 2 sides by rivers and on the 3rd by an electric barricade that survivors term The Throat. Land of the Dead is the first film in the series to receive an MPAA rating for its theatrical release. The more extreme instances of gore were obscured by foreground elements filmed on blue screens, so that these overlaid elements could easily be removed from the unrated DVD. So why exactly was this movie so controversial? Well, according to Variety, the movie was banned for its portrayal of cannibalism, not because of its scenes of humans getting devoured, but due to concerns that such content would bring up negative memories surrounding the Holodomor, a wave of famine which struck the nation in 1933. In Germany, both the theatrical and unrated versions were rated 18, and in Ukraine the film was outright banned. Coming in at 4, Hostel and Hostel Part 2. Hostel is a 2005 slasher film written and directed by Eli Roth. It is also the first installment of the Hostel trilogy, followed by Hostel Part 2 and Hostel Part 3. The plot essentially follows a mysterious organization that tortures and kills kidnapped tourists, specifically 3 friends who are traveling across Europe. Now, as you would expect, a lot of Europeans had issue with the first Hostel movie for making the continent seem like a depraved, torturous place where Americans go to die. However, saying that, it was only in Ukraine that the movie pissed enough people off for it to be banned outright. Both Hostel and its sequel were outlawed in the country for its excessive torture, as well as for depicting Ukraine as a place where tourists disappear for money. Let's discuss Hostel Part 2 though. Released in 2007 and directed once again by Eli Roth, the plot follows 3 American female art students in Rome, who are directed to a Slavic village where they are kidnapped and taken to a facility in which rich clients pay to torture and kill people. The film has been restricted to adults in most countries, however it has been cut in Germany, and the German extended version has subsequently been banned in Germany. A court in Munich ruled the release of the film to be punishable by law. The film was then banned outright in New Zealand upon a submission to the ratings board, after the distributor refused to make cuts in order to receive an R rating. On October 8, 2007, the film was cited in the House of Commons of the United Kingdom as an example where stills from the film could be illegal to possess under the proposed law to criminalise possession of extreme pornography. Coming in at 3, The Devils, 1971. The Devils is a 1971 British historical drama horror movie directed by Ken Russell and starring Oliver Reed and Vanessa Redgrave. The film is a dramatised historical account of the rise and fall of Urbain Grandier, a 17th century Roman Catholic priest executed for witchcraft following the supposed possessions in Loudun, France. It also focuses on Sister Jeannie de Anges, a sexually repressed nun who inadvertently incites the accusations. The Devils was partly adapted from the 1952 non-fiction book The Devils of Loudun by Aldous Huxley, and partly on the 1960 play The Devils by John Whiting, also based on Huxley's book. The film faced harsh criticism upon its release from the National Film Rating Systems due to its disturbingly violent, sexual and religious content, and originally received an X rating in both the United Kingdom and the United States. It was also banned in several countries and in turn heavily edited for release in others. The explicit sexual and violent content paired with its commentary on religious institutions resulted in the film suffering significant censorship. Commenting on the movie's nature, Reed stated, "We never set out to make a pretty Christian film. Charlton Heston made enough of those. The film is about twisted people." The movie has actually never received a release in its original uncut form, saying that critics dismissed the film for its explicit content, though it did go on to win the awards for Best Director at the Venice Film Festival, as well as from the US National Board of Review. The Devils received critical backlash upon its release due to its outrageous, overheated and pornographic nature, and went on to be publicly condemned by the Vatican. And finally coming in at number 1, Freaks 1932. Freaks is a 1932 pre-code horror movie produced and directed by Todd Browning. For those who don't know, pre-code refers to the period of time in Hollywood where film was transitioning into talkies, and it was no holds barred. Films could get away with so much without there being any repercussions. That was until the Code Authority came along and changed everything. However, I digress, we'll return to that later. The movie itself follows a trapeze artist who joins a group of carnival sideshow performers with a plan to seduce and murder a dwarf in the group to gain his inheritance, but her plot proved to have dangerous consequences. The film is based on elements from the short story Spurs by Todd Robbins. The movie was given a test screening with audience members reacting negatively to the movie's grotesque content. In response to this, the movie was significantly cut and additional footage was incorporated. However, despite the cuts made to the movie, Freaks still garnered notice due to the fact that its eponymous characters were portrayed by people who worked as sideshow performers and had real disabilities. Due to this, the film was banned in the United Kingdom for over 30 years and was labelled as brutal and grotesque in Canada. Although it received critical backlash, Freaks was subject to reappraisal in the 60s and has since been shown frequently throughout the United States as a midnight movie. As of right now, Freaks holds an approval rating of 94% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the general consensus reading, "Time has been kind to this horror legend. Freaks managed to frighten, shock and even touch viewers in ways that contemporary viewers missed, and still holds true. Freaks, in my opinion, is one of the most important pieces of horror cinema and still remains one of the most disturbing films I've had the pleasure of watching." I also wrote my entire university dissertation on it, so.
Kicking off at number 5, Tusk 2014.
With the venom traveling to your heart, it forced the doctor to save your life, to take rather, as we say, drastic measures.
Alright guys, Tusk is messed up. So messed up that when Kevin Smith announced it, people were so excited that he was making a new movie, and then within that same breath were absolutely disgusted by how damn messed up his newest creation was. But that isn't to say that it's not just straight up horror goodness, because it is. It's just really, really gross, wrapped up in the most surprising of all animalistic packages, the walrus. Written and directed by the off-the-wall genius Kevin Smith, Tusk tells a tale of a podcast host named Wallace, played by Justin Long, who heads to the remote north of Canada to interview a grizzled old sailor who promises to reveal a lifetime of interesting stories as new material for his show. What's that got to do with the walrus, you may ask? Well, I'll let you find out for yourself. Just bear in mind that Tusk is equal parts hilarious, but only in the way that the most nightmarish of fever dreams can be. The thing is, Kevin Smith is a divisive filmmaker regardless of your stance on this movie. You either love his work or you think it's pointless and you hate it, and many people felt the same about Tusk in particular. For the most part, it was torn apart by critics, but if my opinion holds any weight with top 5 scary viewers, then trust me, Tusk is one of the best attempts at modern body horror in a long time, and it's freakishly unique in its own perverse way. This film is absurd, and it defines the horrific hilarity of the human form being stripped away and broken down on several different levels. As a surprising side note, Justin Long is awesome in Tusk, as is Michael Parks as the terrifyingly convincing serial killer turned veterinary surgeon, Howard. Watch this film, and the next time you go to a zoo, you'll think twice about what's behind the bars. Coming in at number 4, Slither 2006. Slither, an underappreciated precious gem of a movie and a worthy entry into the halls of horror fandom. If you're expecting scares from this particular film, please don't hold your breath, but if you're in the mood for some of the grossest physical effects in the genre, as well as some of the most genuinely hilarious moments in horror comedy, then this one is for you. Written and directed by James Gunn in his first ever directorial debut, Slither was written by a horror fan for horror fans, and it's a throwback to pretty much every B-movie ever made, all wrapped up neatly in the most disgusting of horror concepts, a malevolent alien parasite that injects its larva into a town full of humans. That's a great start for any body horror, right? Slither tells a tale of the small town of Wheelsey, South Carolina, that becomes the host of a sentient alien parasite that crash lands in the surrounding wilderness and subsequently infects the local man about town, Grant, played by the absolutely incredible and equal parts hilarious Michael Rooker. Of course, that's just the beginning, because what ensues is a writhing descent into the desecration of the human body in the most disgusting way possible, as people become wrapped up in the alien parasite's insatiable hunger for breeding with human flesh. And I do mean that literally. Following its release in 2006, this film was a complete flop at the box office, but hey, body horror is an acquired taste, right? Just like alien larva. Ugh. Gross. Next up at number 3, From Beyond, 1986.
Humans are such easy prey. Let her go!
And you may be expecting the legendary Reanimator to fill this space instead of From Beyond, and in many ways, rightfully so, as Stuart Gordon's incredible interpretation of the works of Howard Phillips Lovecraft is one of the finest splatterhouse movies ever made. But as far as disgusting, twisted body horror goes, his next foray into the perverse side of science fiction and cosmic horror is the better demonstration of the two. From Beyond is a gross film, there is no doubt in it, and it's in its portrayal of science gone wrong where we're treated to some of the most insanely eye-opening physical effects. In fact, what starts as a film similar in tone to Reanimator, with some low-budget humour and deadpan delivery from the awesome Jeffrey Combs, quickly turns into a stomach-churning thrill ride of over-exaggerated gore and the gut-wrenching physical realisation of some of the more insaner Lovecraftian narrative concepts. Written and directed by Stuart Gordon alongside his production squad of Dennis Powley and Brian Yuzna, From Beyond is based upon the short story of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft, and yet it takes a few more twists and turns into its descent into the darker side of human consciousness. It tells the tale of two scientists, Pretorius and Tillinghast, who've developed a machine known as the Resonator that simulates the human pineal gland in the search to find other dimensional planes. Well, of course, as we all know, when you go meddling with the many layers of cosmic horror, of course it's filled to the brim with terrifying fleshy creatures and writhing tentacle-ridden monstrosities. Yeah, if you want body horror, From Beyond has it in spades from start to finish, and it's both great and gross the whole while through. Swinging in next at number 2, Altered States, 1980.
Defiant, Eddie. You made it real, you can make it unreal.
If you can't tell already, science and body horror go hand in hand. And although we've rightly given credit to the godfather of body horror, David Cronenberg, particularly in the likes of The Fly, Videodrome and Scanners, there is one classic of conceptual body horror that we all may have forgotten about. Ken Russell's mind-bending 1980 science fiction existential horror, Altered States. And if you haven't seen this film, then I'm not exactly sure what to tell you, because really, it's something else entirely. Now, it's important to note that whilst the physical effects of this film aren't exactly in league with the likes of Cronenberg and the Lovecraftian works of Stuart Gordon, it's in the implication of this particular body horror where the true gross out and terror of this film lies. Directed by the off-the-wall legend of cinema that is the late great Ken Russell, the man responsible for 1971's The Devils, as well as the epic musical Tommy, based on the album of the same name by The Who, Russell's diverse and often overwhelming cinematic catalogue probably sums up just how strange and weird Altered States really is. It tells the tale of Edward, a scientist played by William Hurt in his debut role, who becomes obsessed with the notion of other states of consciousness, and so he descends into an addiction of sensory deprivation tanks and hallucinogenic drugs in the pursuit of reaching them. But of course, this is a horror film, and that particular cautionary tale of curiosity killing cats comes with a price. This film is insane. It's everything mashed up into one, and it will make you think twice whether we really are just meat sacks being piloted by our own brains. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Teto The Iron Man, 1989. Because we just have to end with a bang, and there is no other film that could have quite lived up to just exactly how bad crazy Teto The Iron Man really is. There are a few rules to body horror, I suppose, that keeps it in line with the narrative intention without just ending up like a torture porn flick akin to the Human Centipede or others of its ilk. But in its own equally unique way, Tetsuo takes a look at those rules and throws them off the top of a damn building. Where do I even begin with this film? I know that I say that quite a lot, but really it's never been more appropriate. Imagine if David Lynch took Eraserhead and then made it watch The Fly and then buzzed it up with some German experimental cinema and then released the whole thing in Japan. And then you'll kind of get an idea just how insanely messed up this movie really is. But in a strange way, it's also awesome. I mean, the reason you're even watching this list is because body horror can gross you out in all of the best ways, and Teto The Iron Man will gross you out with every single frame. I almost can't even explain the plot without fear of somehow giving you guys the wrong impression. Written and directed by Shinya Tsukamoto, Tetsuo is a cyberpunk horror film that tells a tale of a man obsessed with metal and the lengths that he'll go to fulfill his twisted desires. Kind of. Yeah. Honestly guys, as far as body horror goes, this is the tippity top of the Machine Man metal pile. I don't even know what else to say, just watch it and be prepared, I guess, please.
This 2011 horror directed by Ty West follows two employees at a New England hotel who decide to investigate stories of hauntings and the paranormal. However, their curiosity awakens something far more sinister. As it goes, The Innkeepers was a pretty run-of-the-mill horror movie. However, it might ring a bell for you for a completely different reason. It now resides amongst the alleged cursed horror films in history. According to sources, this is in part due to Ty West making unfortunate mistakes during shooting, including housing the movie crew and himself in one of the most haunted hotels in Connecticut, the Yankee Peddler Inn, while they shot the film. History tells that the Yankee Peddler Inn is known for having ghostly apparitions and poltergeist activity. Not only that, but guests at the inn have reported having nightmarish dreams. The curse that followed the film was mostly based on ghosts, with them seemingly taking offense to having a film made about them. Actors who stayed on set also reported feeling weird cold spots, as well as seeing strange things including shattering light bulbs during shooting.
Damien, it's all for you.
20th Century Fox presents a film of psychological suspense.
Released back in 1976, this horror directed by Richard Donner follows American diplomat Robert as he adopts Damien following the death of his unborn child. A series of sinister events unfold and Robert quickly comes to the conclusion that he may have adopted the Antichrist. To begin, the film was released on June 6, 1976, aka 666. Right off the bat, the film was daring the devil to get involved, with the first incident occurring when the special effects designer for the film was involved in a car accident, which left his assistant dead. Leading on from that, after actor Gregory Peck signed on to the film, his own son committed suicide. Peck would also go on to experience more upsetting and disturbing phenomenons when a bolt of lightning struck his plane as it was crossing the Atlantic, and a second bolt of lightning striking producer Mace Newfield's plane, with the latter setting the engine ablaze and almost resulting in it crashing. Animal attacks also occurred on set, with multiple actors and trainers receiving injuries. And guys, it doesn't end there. A group of people heading to set got into a car accident and Richard Donner's hotel was bombed by the IRA during filming. So what do you guys think? Was Satan behind these unexplainable incidents? In at 3, The Exorcist, 1973.
There are no experts. You probably know as much about possession as most priests. Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon, she says she's the devil himself.
It's not hard to believe that one of the most terrifying and controversial supernatural horror movies in history would suffer some bizarre occurrences during production. Released back in 1973 and directed by William Friedkin, The Exorcist follows a young girl, Reagan, as she becomes possessed by a demon after playing with a Ouija board. To begin, the screening of The Exorcist kicked off by having a 16th century church across the street from the theatre get struck by lightning. Not only that, but during production of the film, the set caught on fire in the room that was supposed to be the family's home. Reagan's room was unexplainably untouched. This resulted in the shoot being delayed, but when they returned, the tragedies continued. Around 8 different deaths are connected with the film, including actors Valisky Malyaros and Jack McGowan, who died shortly after post-production, which baffled many as both their characters also died in the film. Many injuries also occurred, even one involving Ellen Burstyn, who plays the mother of Reagan. Burstyn was seriously injured during one scene that actually made it into the film. At one point, Burstyn gets thrown back into the the wall, however her harness broke, resulting in her colliding at full speed, and the blood-curdling scream you hear is actually real. Linda Blair, who played Reagan, also suffered when she was thrown off the bed by an unseen force. And finally, the voice of the demonic entity we see in the film, Mercedes McCambridge, was the tragic victim of a domestic violence killing shortly after the film was released. Coming in at number 2, Poltergeist, 1982.
I've never sensed anything like it.
That thing is in there with my baby!
Poltergeist has gone down as one of the most notoriously unlucky films in history, and for a good reason. Released in 1982, Poltergeist follows the strange and creepy happenings that befall an average California family, as ghosts attempt to communicate with them through the television, even sucking in their youngest daughter, Carol Ann. Now, there are many theories as to why Poltergeist attracted such negative energy, many concluding that it's because Spielberg opted to use real human skeletons as props without telling the actors. Gross. Not only that, but Dominique Dunne, who played Dana Freeman, died during production at the age of 23. She was murdered by an abusive ex-boyfriend who choked her into a coma, which she never awoke from. Heather O'Rourke, who played Carol Ann, died at just 12 years old. It was sudden, with the young girl being linked to an undetected illness. It doesn't stop there either. A mechanical clown that was used actually tried to strangle actor Oliver Robbins. He was choked so hard by the clown that he actually had marks on his neck following the incident. Not only that, but James Caan, who wrote the novelization of the movie, reported seeing some truly creepy stuff. He stated that lightning struck the buildings that he was writing in, noting, "The facing on the air conditioning unit blew off, flew across the room and hit me in the back. After about half a minute or a minute, the lights flickered and went on, and then all the video games in the room started playing themselves." And finally in at number 1, Antrum, the deadliest film ever made, 1988/2018. The film has had a long and weird history, with it being produced back in the 1970s by brothers documenting an occult ritual before disappearing and resurfacing back in 1988. After a screening at a film festival in Budapest, the theatres burned to the ground, resulting in several of the event's programmers dying under mysterious circumstances. Moving on from that, a couple of years later, a riot erupted in a theatre in San Francisco that was screening Antrum, and during which time, the only physical copy of the film went missing. Now, once again, the film has emerged, with it making the rounds at film festivals last year. Now, I may be cheating by putting this film as number 1, as it was recently revealed that the film itself is a mockumentary. However, the filmmakers have openly stated that they believe the film has blurred the lines between fiction and reality by encouraging people to add to its mythology. Executive producer Eric 13 was quoted as saying, "Everywhere I went, people were talking about this secret film, Antrum, filmmakers passing it around. You'd hear that it was from the 70s, or that it was part documentary, or that it had cursed footage spliced into it. One person literally dared me to watch it, which I frankly scoffed at. Still, I had to know what the film really was, and once I saw it, the feelings wouldn't leave. The allure of something you weren't supposed to watch." Chilling.
Kicking off at number 5, Willow Creek, 2013.
Crazy.
Pets and people go missing all the time.
I'll go in there myself. You can just stay here in town if you want.
You believe any nut job out there that says Sasquatch is real?
And for our first brush with folklore in horror cinema, we're heading over to North America with perhaps one of the most legendary paranormal creatures and sources of forestry urban legend, Bigfoot. And while you may think that Bigfoot has historically been more miss than hit in horror cinema, this film definitely has something to say about that. Written and directed by Bobcat Goldthwait in his first ever foray into horror cinema, Willow Creek is your standard indie found footage handheld horror about Bigfoot lore and is heavily influenced by the legendary Patterson-Gimlin footage of 1967. However, while on the surface this film definitely doesn't do anything new, and it doesn't exactly break any new ground for horror cinema, as we step through the woods of Northern California, the folklore of the Sasquatch and Bigfoot has never been more real. Willow Creek tells the tale of Jim and his long-suffering girlfriend Kelly. Jim is a fanatic believer of Bigfoot lore and an avid amateur cryptozoologist in pursuit of the big hairy unknown. In classic found footage fashion, Jim's idea of a romantic getaway is to head into the Six Rivers National Forest and hopefully find the infamous dry sandbar deep in the woods where the Patterson-Gimlin footage was shot and film the whole thing along the way. It's a simple premise with a relatively simple interpretation of folklore. Bigfoot is just a giant hairy elusive humanoid that lives deep in the wild, right? Well, Willow Creek definitely believes that, but it has a lot more to say about the implications of the unknown. I'll say no more because whilst this film is short and straightforward in its approach, it also packs in so much more and expands upon an already intriguing folklore. Also, mark my words, the last few frames of this film will make your hair stand on end in some way or another. Next up at number 3, Little Otic, 2000. And where the hell do I even begin with this film? I know I say that a lot, but perhaps the most fitting example of that phrase is this film. Way back in the day when I was taking film class at college, we were studying European surrealism, and this film just so happened to rock up one day on my watch list, and still to this day, I think back at how utterly messed up it is. But don't get me wrong, this film isn't messed up in the sense of, say, a Serbian film. This film is messed up because it's just so strangely weird, bizarre, not quite like anything you've ever seen or will see. It's not even a horror film. In fact, it's pretty damn hilarious in places, but trust me, Little Otik is a horror experience. Written and directed by the legendary surrealist Jan Svankmajer, Little Otik is a Czech film based upon the Otisanic fairy tale from 19th century Czechoslovakia. And what's that, you may ask? Well, Otisania is a dark European cautionary folktale about a couple that have been struggling to conceive a child together. One day out in the fields, the husband finds a strange log of wood that curiously resembles the figure of a baby, and so he decides to bring it home to his wife. The couple are completely overjoyed by their new wooden child, and suddenly that log baby comes to life and demands to be fed. But then as time passes, the baby can't stop eating and Otisania gets hungrier and hungrier, and you can see where this is going, right? Little Otik is incredibly straightforward with its narrative, but Jan Svankmajer manages to squeeze every last terrifying and intriguing drop out of this fairy tale. He blends strange, twisted stop motion animation with live action set pieces, and this film really is a feast for your eyes. Although it isn't a traditional horror film, so to speak, if you haven't seen Little Otik, please do, because you won't be forgetting it in a hurry. Swinging in at number 2, November 2017. This film is beautiful and sick and twisted and brilliant and everything you could ever want from a horror fantasy based on folklore, because it's a hodgepodge of all of those things woven beautifully in those same surreal dark tones of Northern Europe. This film shot way under the radar, and admittedly it may be a little too art house for some people, but forget about that, because visually speaking, from a horror perspective, this film is worth so much. There's nothing like it. It's exciting and it's brilliant, and films like this, as well as Robert Eggers' The Witch, are important entries into both folklore and horror cinema. Written and directed by Rainer Sarnet, November is an Estonian dark fantasy horror based upon the novel Rehepap Ek November by Andrus Kirivak, which is essentially a modern grim fairy tale about the price of young love and the dangers that come with it. Aren't they all, eh? Set in a small 19th century village in Estonia that is unwittingly besieged by every magical creature in the forest, spirits, wood elves, trolls, gnolls, and even the devil himself, the folklore elements of November are juxtaposed by a very real historical reality. You see, the town is also besieged by the Black Death, the plague, and the church are trying their utmost to save some souls. Behind that though is the backdrop of a young love triangle trying their best to circumvent each other's heart's desires in the classic cautionary fashion that we all expect. I don't say this lightly, but this film is Shakespearean. There's so much calamity going on that it's almost like a horror depiction of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it lends itself perfectly to the ingenuity of Baltic folklore and literature. Despite that though, November also crams in all the dirt, grime, and the very physical gore of pain and existence out in the rural mire of 19th century Europe, and that alone makes it worth a watch. This film is brilliant. Give it a watch. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Sauna, 2008. Let me preface this with a very important point. This film is hella messed up, and you will either love this film or you will hate it. It's as simple as that. But the reason this film takes our number 1 spot, despite me being a massive fan of it, is down to its no-nonsense approach to the stark realities of folklore and the price of human life that is often paid in its cautionary tales. 2008 Sauna does not pull any punches. It doesn't sugarcoat the realities of death with the magical or mystical, and because of that, it's perhaps one of the starkest interpretations of myth and legend of recent times. Sauna, otherwise known as Filth or Evil Rising in its English release, tells a tale of 2 brothers in Finland in 1595. It takes place at the end of the bloody Russo-Swedish War, and the brothers, one of them a violent and grizzled warrior and the other a kind and timid scholar, are tasked with marking the new border between Finland and Russia. So what does a sauna have to do with it? Well, I'll leave that for you all to discover, because part of the appeal of this film is pulling at the thread of its mystery. But heading into this film, you may need to know, although it may not seem like it, the folklore connotations of one of Scandinavia's most ancient pastimes, the steamed hut and hovels of a sauna play a very significant and horrifying role in this film. There are so many tales throughout Finnish folklore about the dangers of meeting mischievous figures behind the ancient myths of a sauna, but this film is instead concerned with its surprising spiritual connection and the role it played in the cleansing of sins. You may have to dig deep into this film to truly understand its significance to folklore, but put it this way, the Sami people of northern Finland were one of the last bastions of ancient paganism and remained unconverted by Christianity until the 18th century. Keep that thought in your head and then watch this film. I'll say no more. Kicking off at number 5, Road Games, 1981.
Oh, he's just killed a girl.
Did he make love to her first?
I don't know. What's the difference?
It makes a lot of difference. I think in order to play the game properly, we have to know what he thinks of women.
And the fact that this film is widely forgotten by the mainstream is a feat in and of itself, because stylistically, Road Games is a visual treat that was way ahead of its time. It's also widely considered by none other than Quentin Tarantino to be his favourite film ever made. If that's not an accolade, I don't know what is. Released in 1981, Road Games is an Australian horror thriller set in the outback, produced and directed by Richard Franklin and written by Everett de Roche, and starring, you just wait for it, the one, the only Jamie Lee Curtis, during a time when her career as the greatest final girl of horror history had already been cemented in John Carpenter's Halloween. She figured she'd head over to Australia, shoot this film, and then everyone kind of forgot about it. But they shouldn't have, because it's really good. What plays out is an incredibly straightforward storyline. A truck driver named Patrick Quid, played by the formidable Stacey Keach, travels across the outback, picks up a hitchhiker, Jamie Lee Curtis, all the while a killer is on the loose. And because of that simple storyline, what plays out is an almost Hitchcockian runaway train, with direct nods to the tight dialogue and characterization of Rear Window and North by Northwest. If you're into equal parts sweeping vistas and equal parts close quarters violence, you will absolutely love this film. Coming in at number 4, Parents, 1989. Alright, you'll either love this film or you'll hate it, because the very DNA of this film is divisive in nature, and it's a questionable subjective approach to confront what is essentially psychological child abuse with what is also essentially a throwback horror comedy. But for me, it works, and 1989's Parents is a gem of over-amplified yet endearing horror. Directed by Bob Balaban and written by Christopher Hawthorne, Parents tells the story of a 10-year-old kid named Michael and his parents Nick and Lily, who've just moved from Massachusetts to a new neighborhood in 1954 suburbia. Also, turns out that his parents are cannibals and they're in the habit of killing people, chopping them up and serving it to the poor kid, unbeknownst to him, in his spaghetti bolognese. Not cool, parents. Not cool at all. Yeah, listen, this film was an absolute flop at the box office, and Balaban's foray into feature filmmaking never truly recovered. But if you scratch away the surface, Parents is just an incredibly entertaining and straight up grotesque display of mom and pop suburban horror. While the tone may be off in some parts, the fact that we see this whole thing through the eyes of a child is horrifying enough. Next up at number 3, The Gate, 1987. And for many people throughout the 90s, this was the film that would randomly pop up late at night on a rerun horror channel, unsuspectingly to scare the living daylight out of us kids. For a kid, 1987's The Gate is actually a terrifying movie, but watching it later in life, it's such an entertaining horror flick that it's hard to pass it by. And also, given that this film was given a meager $2.5 million budget for what was essentially intended to be a blockbuster feature, it's incredible what was stylistically achieved. Written by Michael Nankin and directed by Tibor Takacs, The Gate is essentially the Goonies for lovers of Lovecraftian fiction. The plot follows a kid called Glenn who, alongside his buddies, discover a portal to a nightmarish domain of evil gods right in his backyard. And what plays out is a classic tale of a bunch of ramshackle suburban kids trying to battle the forces of evil. But this film shines in its small nuanced scenes where the true horror begins to reveal itself. I don't really want to ruin anything, but there's a scene where Glenn dreams that he's dancing with what he thinks is his dead mother, but it turns out to be something much more horrifying than that. Give this one a watch, you'll have fun either way. Swinging in at number 2, Opera, 1987. Man, this film is insane. We briefly spoke about Italian giallo horror a week or so ago, and 1987's Opera is perhaps one of the best modern demonstrations of this strange and alluring style of horror cinema. Also known as Terror at the Opera, this film was written and directed by Italian cinematic legend Dario Argento, the man also responsible for the fantastic 1977 supernatural thriller Suspiria. An Opera follows the story of a woman named Betty, the unwitting star of an avant-garde production of Verdi's Macbeth, who is stalked by a mysterious and exceedingly violent killer. It's a fantastic, horrific mystery, and stylistically is a frantic joy to watch. The thing is though, director Dario Argento refused to budge when the studio tried to cut the last 11 minutes of this film, and because of that, Opera was never released theatrically, only being made available in the US as a VHS release. I think perhaps if it was released fully to theatres, then this film would have cemented its place amongst the greats of horror cinema. 1987 was a year of hits and misses for horror cinema, but Opera would have probably taken the box office if it had the chance. And finally, our number one spot, Kronos, 1993. And damn it, I just love this film, and for those of you that don't know, Kronos is the first feature film ever made by the main man himself, Guillermo del Toro, although widely it never truly received the recognition that it deserved. Released in 1993 and written and directed by Guillermo del Toro, Kronos tells the story of Jesus Gris, a religious antiques dealer who miraculously comes into possession of an ancient mechanical scarab-like device that inadvertently dishes out the power of eternal life. But by eternal life, what we really mean is vampirism. It's interesting though, because like with most of Del Toro's work, this isn't exactly a film about vampires, yet relies on his painfully original blend of mythology and religious iconography to deliver an authentic tale of fantasy and suspense rooted in atmospheric horror. Again, like with most of his work, Kronos could easily be lifted straight from the folklore of South America and Europe, none of which is based in oversaturated gore, but instead delivered as the dark horror and violence of humanity's brush with the magical and the mystic. As Del Toro painfully continues to remind us, there is a price to pay for the curious, and Kronos is great if you're curious, so just give it a watch. Kicking off at number 5, Tole, 2012.
Elvis, jag ska ha några bötter där inne. Ska ha den.
Now, some of you may pronounce this film Thale, which is fine. I mean, it's Tole, but whatever, say what you want. Okay, let's get this out of the way first and foremost. This film is low budget, like really, really low budget, as in $10,000 low budget, and that may perhaps detract from a few people's enjoyment of this film, because for the most part, you can tell that this film is low budget. There's no hiding it, but to hell with that, because even with the scratchy CGI, this film is perhaps the literal definition of folklore in horror cinema, focusing on one of Scandinavia's most legendary forest creatures, the Hulda, which are essentially the same sirens and succubi of Greek and Eastern mythology, encapsulated in this case as the legendary spirits of the wild woodlands of Norway. And while this film has a particularly bold premise, the magic of it comes with how much focus there is on the smaller details of the magical and the horrifying price that comes with meddling in such an ancient power. Written and directed by Alexander Nordas in his feature film debut, Taret tells the tale of two guys, Alvis and Leo, who are down on their luck but struggle to make ends meet by running a crime scene cleanup business. And one particularly gruesome job, they discover a strange, oddly humanoid creature hidden in a basement. A girl named Tole, who despite the mystical nature of her being, has been imprisoned against her will and then subject to vile medical experiments and torture. Yeah, pretty bold premise, right? But that's what makes this film awesome. It's brave enough to essentially take what should be a found footage idea and slam it together with a fly on the wall approach to folklore in horror. This film isn't perfect by any means, but it stands on its own as one of the truest depictions of what horror can do when it picks apart the threads of cultural lore. Give it a watch. Coming in at number 4, Under the Shadow, 2016. And let's preface this with the fact that this film is bleak. really, really bleak. But also on the flip side to that coin, also strangely mystifying and alluring in ways that only the supernatural folklore and mythologies of the Middle East can be. And for those of you with Netflix, it's pretty much available to stream in every country, so you have no excuse to not watch this film, really. And also, whilst this film received the fickle appraisal service of a vast host of film critics, a fact that will oftentimes put some people off, it really does live up to its hype. And 2016's Under the Shadow does something with the horror genre that many films fail to do. It made itself historically relevant without once sacrificing any portion of its narrative to do so. It's seamless, and because of that, this film hits relentlessly hard on many different levels, carving its own place in the landscape of horror fiction, yet sitting beside films such as Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, as well as her 2018 film The Nightingale, two films that may give you a sense of the tone to Under the Shadow. Written and directed by Babak Anvari, Under the Shadow tells a tale of a mother, Shida, and her daughter, Korsa, who are caught amidst the final year of the Iran-Iraq war that ravaged throughout the late 1980s and find themselves sheltered in their apartment building in Tehran as the Iraqi army shell the city with bombs and mortar fire, and her neighbouring residents slowly disappear amidst the chaos. Shida stands defiant though, whilst her husband, a doctor who has been drafted to the front line, pleads for her to leave. I won't say any more because part of the terrifying magic of this film comes with discovering the deep-rooted cautionary tale of its lore, but let me put it this way: Under the Shadow doesn't rely on jump scares to hit hard with its horror. In fact, its most unsettling scene involves a toy doll, but start to finish this film is eerie in ways not often found in cinema. This film comes from a dark place, and it offers an unrelenting insight into the horrors found in the hearts of men and monsters alike. Next up at number 3, Rare Exports, 2010.
We are standing on the biggest burial mound in the world.
Tänne on haudattu jotain.
Which is perhaps a film a little bit lighter in tone, but please don't let its otherwise jolly appearance fool you, because this film has more blood, guts, and naked ice elf whites than you may first imagine. And you may be a little perturbed at the fact that what is essentially a Christmas film finds its way upon our list, but if you know anything about the true tale behind Santa Claus, you'll know that there is quite a hell of a lot to be scared of. And of course, what better place to encapsulate the dread-inducing folklore of Satan Claus himself than the weird and wonderful place known only as Finland, Mitä Helvet. But really, we have to highlight the fact that Finland is an incredibly unique place and is perhaps the only country and culture that could have ever created this film, and we're all the better off because of it. If you've never seen Rare Exports, please don't wait for Christmas to roll around, because it's worth a watch any time of the year. Written and directed by Jalmari Helander, Rare Exports: A Christmas Tale tells its story in one part English and one part Finnish language, serving as a neat little filter before descending fully into the unabashed idiosyncrasies of northern Lapland. It focuses on a British research team and a local family of reindeer herders who unassumingly release an ancient fell, a long-forgotten burial mound built by the Sami people over centuries as a means to imprison a malevolent creature, a horned being that whips misbehaving children and then boils them in a cauldron one day every year. And yeah, that horrifying horned creature, of course, is Santa Claus. But listen, despite its ridiculous premise, Rare Exports lays on the folklore of Finland so seamlessly that you can't help but go along with its breakneck horror goodness as Pitari and his father try and cling to life on a day that's meant for rest and celebration. Yeah, trust me, Rare Exports is a film like no other, and it's a horror experience of pure folklore. Swinging in at number 2, The Ritual, 2017.
I saw shadows! What? I don't know! Took it! Hurt!
And you may sense a little bit of a theme within our final 2 entries, but what the hell, there's a lot of dread-inducing folklore to be found here, and it's probably in our best interest to highlight the hallowed, horrifying halls of Scandinavian cultural mythology in order to do so. The Ritual is an awesome film, which strangely enough kinda got torn apart by a few critics, but forget about that, because if you were fans of Neil Marshall's The Descent, then you'll 100% be a fan of this film, which is claustrophobic in all the right ways, as well as being oddly reminiscent of Dog Soldiers, just without the werewolves, and instead replaced with the many beasts and fanatical worshippers of Nordic mythology. Now, don't get me wrong, this film isn't perfect, and in many ways it takes its sweet time to get going, but once it does, it's a folklore ride that is very much worth the wait. Directed by David Bruckner and based upon the novel of the same name by Adam Neville, The Ritual tells the tale of 4 friends that met at university, Phil, Dom, Hutch, and Luke, who after following the tragic death of one of their friends decide to kickstart the grieving process by hiking through the Kungsleden, also known as the King King's Trail in Sarek National Park of northern Sweden, a place that their friend had always wanted to visit before his untimely death. And come on, you know where this is going, right? It's a horror film. But what begins as an archetypal frightful foray into the dark wooded places of the world, it quickly shifts gears about halfway through, and the actual terrors that lurk within the forest are of a much more horrifying design than what we're accustomed to. The British folk revival is an exciting new look at horror, blending tales of the old with the new, and although The Ritual has been somewhat overlooked by the subgenre down to its release direct to Netflix, it definitely deserves its place on this list. Give it a watch. You won't be disappointed. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Troll Hunter 2010. I, for one, absolutely adore this film, and whilst it may not be the most explicit depiction of horror, when it comes to a modern interpretation of folklore and the mythological monstrosities that come with it, 2010's Troll Hunter is second to none. And it's one that leaves its mark by in no way shying away from the mystical and the magical, but instead embracing it so fully and tightly that it's in danger of ripping its own arms off. Like a giant troll. Despite being a film that probably wouldn't have been made without the reverence of folklore and the actual joy of gradually unwinding its narrative through a handheld camera, the quality of the craft behind Troll Hunter catapults it entirely into a league of its own. It's brilliant, and if you've ever been told to watch Troll Hunter but for some reason didn't, give it another look. Written and directed by Andre Øvredal, who would go on to create the fantastic 2016 horror The Autopsy of Jane Doe, and is built to tackle 2019's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which, as a side note, is going to be equally awesome. Troll Hunter tells the tale of a group of students from Volda University College as they head to the remote regions of northern Norway in pursuit of a series of alleged poachers who are hunting bears illegally in the wild. Well, soon of course the students realise that it's not exactly bears that they should be searching for, but instead a colony of ravenous trolls, a race of mythical monstrosities known as the Jotun, the terrifying creatures that were allegedly defeated by Thor himself in the canon of Nordic mythology, but of course he must have missed a few. This film is so much fun that it's worth watching just for the thrill ride. Yeah, it may not be full frontal horror, and it's definitely a film that couldn't have been made in any other way than found footage, but when it comes to folklore, this film is exactly what it says on the tin. It's wholeheartedly Nordic. It exemplifies the folklore traditions of Norwegian culture by thrusting its canon into the heart of modernity, and when it comes to this list, it definitely deserves our number 1 spot. Give it a watch. Kicking off at number 5, The Hole in the Ground 2019.
Yes.
Have you been going anywhere else?
No.
Like the forest, maybe?
Yeah, perhaps one of the most intriguing indie films of the year so far, and who better to pick it up and distribute it than A24, the studio that consistently seems to be knocking it out of the park when it comes to originality in horror, who undoubtedly know a creepy tale when they see one. Written and directed by Lee Cronin in his debut feature film, The Hole in the Ground is a film that covers many themes, mainly being the stress of parenthood and the many trials and tribulations that come with raising a child on your own, but more importantly, it's sprinkled heavily with an incredibly vivid and key aspect of Irish folklore, which is that of the changeling and the old Irish legend of the sinkhole often found out in the woods, a symbol of something far more sinister than what it first may seem. Now, although that's probably quite a bit of plot revelation, it's also obviously the name of the film, and we can't really talk about its relation to folklore without touching on the significance of what it actually entails, but trust me, that's all I'll say about the plot. But also, don't worry about that, because start to finish, this film expertly manages to pack in so much substance into its 90-minute runtime, and there's a bucket load of slow, creepy paranoia and deeply unsettling tones of the wilderness to chew upon. There is a lot to be found in this film, and surprisingly so, that's what makes it highly enjoyable. Part and parcel of The Hole in the Ground is trying to juggle exactly what's going on as we gradually attempt to unwind the many layers and myths of Irish folklore and their significance to the modern era. Yeah, as far as Irish folklore goes, this one sits right beside some of the best. Coming in at number 4, Taret 2017. And although Spanish cinema often interweaves the magical and mystical aspects of folklore into pretty much all of their cinematic canon, with films like The Orphanage, The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth leading the charge in modern cinema, Taret, also known as The Blacksmith and the Devil, is perhaps one of the most vivid portrayals of European folklore in recent times. And it focuses entirely on what is essentially one of the oldest fairy tales of all time, The Smith and the Devil, with this film portraying its folklore version from the Basque region of Spain and France. If you've heard that tale before, one that can be found in all corners of Europe from Russia to Germany, Greece and Italy, then you'll know exactly what it entails. But if not, then I'll keep stum and let you discover it for yourself. From a technical perspective, Elementary is an absolutely beautiful film, and both its practical and digital effects manage to vividly paint the picture of the eternal magical mystery of European folklore and the ancient customs and cultures that are held within it. If anything, this film is remarkably important in that it accurately manages to tell a folktale without once becoming boring, or even more importantly, it never misses the point. In many ways, it's a period piece. In others, it's a film that holds itself eternal with the mysticism of its narrative, and it captures that same charm of being told a fairy tale when we were kids, although on the flip side to that same magic means this film isn't entirely terrifying. Trust me, you won't be screaming into your hands and shuddering with fear, and for fans of more explicit horror, Elementary may miss the mark in several ways, but please don't let that put you off, because for fans of folklore and the cautionary tales of European culture, this film is one of a kind, and there should be more like it. Also, it's on Netflix, so give it a watch. Next up at number 3, Wakewood, 2009. A surprising entry of the last decade, and much like our number 5 spot on this list, one of the most vivid depictions of Irish folklore, and yet one that is also threaded with the ancient customs and allegories of pagan mysticism to pin its bones down in a bizarre, ritualistic manner, more akin to the likes of 1973's The Wicker Man, more so than anything. Oh yeah, and also, this film stars Peter Baelish himself, Aidan Gillen, and don't worry, there's no dodgy accent in this film, and Gillen manages to knock 2009's Wakewood out of the park as the not quite sure what to do, but just trying to keep my family apart kind of father, alongside Eva Berthistle as his wife Louise. Written and directed by David Keating, Wakewood tells the tale of Patrick and Louise Daly, whose young daughter Alice is savagely and tragically killed by a dog during the film's opening events. Distraught and grieving, the couple move to the remote rural village of Wakewood, where they seek peace and quiet in the hope of finally coming to terms with their daughter's death. But of course, hell no, this is a horror movie, and Patrick and Louise quickly become confronted by their own grief in the discovery that the village of Wakewood is of course home to a strange and secretive sect of pagan practitioners, and the couple very swiftly understand the meaning of being very careful in what you wish for. I'll say no more about the film's plot, but trust me, for a film produced by the legends of horror, Hammer, who traditionally speaking are notorious for not exactly having the most substantial of narratives, but recently their studio revival has been knocking it out of the park, and because of that, there is a boatload of depth to be found in this film. 2009's Wakewood is tough to handle, and although its low budget is pretty telling on some occasions, for the most part the themes that it covers, folklore or otherwise, are particularly hard hitting. Yeah, give this one a watch. Swinging in at number 2, Witchfinder General, 1968. Vincent Price, the man, the myth, the undoubted legend of cinema, who secured his eternal horror credentials with his absolutely bone-chilling performance as Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General himself, in a time where both folklore and the malign nature of superstition in English history came to their most prominent forefront. And our reverence for Mr. Price aside, 1968's Witchfinder General, also known as The Conqueror Worm, is one of the most important horror films in British folk cinema, where it vividly portrays the infamous, murderous, witch-hunting exploits of Matthew Hopkins, a 17th century English lawyer who claimed to have been appointed as the Witchfinder General by Parliament during the English Civil War. Hopkins claimed that he was appointed to root out sorcery and witchcraft, where he took advantage of the superstitious nature and misaligned fear of the East Anglian locals to pretty grisly effect. I mean, that historical notion in itself forms an absolutely huge part of British folklore, and the atrocities committed by Hopkins are the stuff of cultural cautionary legend, but the reason that it makes its way onto our list is purely for the fact, in terms of folklore, Witchfinder General is one of the most brutal and genuinely unnerving films of the genre. I mean, granted, it's not as outwardly magical and mystical as many of the other films of this list, but trust me, the historical credentials are there. Written and directed by Michael Reeves, based upon the 1966 novel of the same name by Ronald Bassett, Witchfinder General embodies the essence of British folk horror. There are no good guys, there is no omnipotent force that is ready and waiting to save the day. There is only pain and misery and misguided superstition that drives humanity toward it. Yeah, in terms of cautionary tales, this one is near the top of the pile, and it makes for some legendary horror cinema. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Ravenous, 1999.
What are you doing? Oh, I'm sorry. After you.
I absolutely adore this film, and truth be told, I've been looking for a reason to feature some North American folklore on this list, and what better way to do so than with one of the most disgustingly underrated horror movies of the 20th century, 1999's Ravenous. This film is so damn good, and the fact that it still gets disregarded by critics to this day is a travesty. But forget about them, because if you're in the mood for some North American folklore horror set in the mid-1800s, pinned down by the native myth of the Wendigo and the cultural taboo of cannibalism that comes with it, then Ravenous is exactly what the doctor ordered. Just please, don't eat the stew. From a historical perspective, the folklore of this film is wrapped up in some truly bleak accounts of American and European culture, mainly being the horror of the Donna Reed party, as well as the legend of Sawney Bean, the monstrous cannibal of 16th century Scotland. Put it this way, it's somewhere between the two. Directed by Antonio Bird and written by Ted Griffin, Ravenous tells the tale of Lieutenant John Boyd, a man who was promoted to captain by dubious means during the Mexican-American War and is sent to Fort Spencer, a remote military outpost high in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Here, after succumbing to the bleak inhospitality of the region, a mysterious stranger emerges who has word of a particularly terrifying tale. I won't say any more because although this film is pretty telling in its folklore nature, the actual delivery of its narrative is a horror experience to behold, and even as it descends into pure gore and grotesque madness, it still manages to maintain its many textures of storytelling, albeit ones that are bleak and horrifying. Also, the cast of this film is absolutely stacked, and it's tantamount to late 90s cinematic greatness. Guy Pearce, Robert Carlyle, the late John Spencer, David Arquette, Jeremy Davis. Yeah, there's a lot to be found in Ravenous. It's a fantastic depiction of North American folklore, capturing the historical misery and isolation of the period, and it's a straight up horror gem that deserves a watch. Coming in at number 4, Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. Whew, buddy, where do we even begin? What makes this film all the more unstomachable is that following its original release, it was marketed as a horror comedy. Although there isn't a lot of comedy to it, really, or tragedy. It's just kind of flat and bleak and doesn't really offer a lot of anything other than 1,000,001 different methods of onstage torture. Originally shot under the title of Sardu, Master of the Screaming Virgins, and then retitled to The Incredible Torture Show, before settling on the distribution title of Blood-Sucking Freaks, the history of its namesake pretty much sums up its content. It's confused, at best. But despite the non-stop gross-out tactics that Blood-Sucking Freaks deployed, it was the events that unfolded after the film's release that cemented it eternally in the upper echelons of cult classic exploitation cinema. The film's main character, the violent and depraved Dr. Sardu, played by Seamus O'Brien, was stabbed to death by a burglar in his own apartment shortly after the film's release. Not only that, but model Viju Krem, who plays the character of Natasha Di Natale, was shot and killed during a hunting accident several years later. Both of their tragic deaths only added to the cult status of Blood-Sucking Freaks, further contributing to the film's legendary notoriety. Next up at number 3, Serbian film, 2010.
Sprema se nešto veliko. Umetnička pornografija na najvišem nivou i to ovde kod nas.
U Srbiji?
Samo se radi u Srbiji za strano tržište.
Oh boy. I'm not gonna lie guys, I tried to keep this film far away from this list, but eventually it's clear, there's no denying this fact. 2010's A Serbian Film is one of the most widely controversial movies ever made. And rightly so, because if you've seen a Serbian film, you know that seeing it once is one time too many. The thought of watching this film again actually makes me slightly anxious, and if that's not too real, I'm not entirely sure what is. The film itself was investigated in Serbia for crimes against sexual minors and crimes related to protection of minors, bagging the film's writers and directors several court appearances, all of which were later unfounded. Now, don't get me wrong, I kind of wanted to give this film the benefit of the doubt after hearing that it had much more allegorical themes to it than first met the eye. But all of that pretty much goes out of the window after the second act, and any artistic merit that this film had just slowly crumbles in front of your eyes in an even more depressing turn of events. The closing few moments of this film are some of the most mentally scarring scenes I have ever witnessed in cinema. Straight up, brutally honest. And that's alongside several other scenes that already give this film the notoriety it's gathered. You might think that you want to watch a Serbian film. Trust me, you don't. Save yourself the trauma. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Faces of Death, 1978. And there aren't really many clips I could possibly show of 1978's Faces of Death without getting this particular top 5 scary video flagged on all parts of algorithmic no-nos. Because, wow, Faces of Death was so real in the sense that it was, for the most part, literal footage of people dying. Yeah, although several of the human death scenes shown in Faces of Death, as well as a monkey being killed, are obvious fakes, Alan A. Apone, the special effects artist for the movie, claimed that around only 40% of the film is fake. The rest is genuine footage, and it's pretty harrowing stuff. Faces of Death is a curiosity piece. It was made with the purpose to shock and revolt its audience. But when we compare it to the majority of footage that is out there now on the internet, floating around, it isn't exactly anything new. In 1978 though, oh boy was this film the edgiest damn thing you could ever get your hands on. Yeah, I don't really have much more to say on this one. 104 minutes of people dying, most of it is very much real. It made $35 million at the box office. Yeah, Faces of Death. Kicking off at number 5, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, 1971. For those of you that don't know, giallo cinema was a very specific style of Italian horror, particularly tied to the mid to late 1960s, which often employed murder mystery tropes with dramatic suspense building, peaked with bursts of slasher violence and fantasy eroticism. It's not for everyone, but it had a massive impact on later American slasher horror, and perhaps one of the most intriguing examples of giallo cinema is 1971's A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, directed and written by Lucio Fulci. Well, as chance would have it, legendary special effects artist Carlo Rambaldi was actually tied to this film before his work on Steven Spielberg's E.T., and his eye for visual nasties was so convincing that it actually landed the director in an Italian criminal court. During the events of the film, the lead character Carol finds herself wrapped up in an LSD-fueled crime story involving murderous dreams and mind-bending altercations, and at one point finds herself confronted with 4 vivisected dogs, their chests open and their hearts still beating. The physical effects were so convincing that the courts charged Lucio Fulci with animal cruelty, and the director faced a 2-year prison sentence. In the end, Carlo Rambaldi had to present the animatronic creations in front of a court, where the charges were eventually dropped. Now that's a close call. Coming in at number 4, Guinea Pig, Flowers of Flesh and Blood, 1985. Perhaps one of the most controversial depictions of horror cinema in the whole of Japanese history, if not the rest of the world. The Guinea Pig films are a series of 6 Japanese horror films from the early 1980s and 90s, based off of the filmmaker Hideshi Hino's own horror manga series of a similar nature that depicts incredibly graphic and grotesque Japanese body horror and violence. Now listen, this style of horror cinema isn't really for me, but fringe filmmaking has often pushed the boundaries so that the mainstream can further develop the genre as a whole. But on the flip side, Hideshi Hino's work had a pretty rough time, to say the least, and the filmmaker had to constantly prove that no one was actually hurt or murdered during production. While in a bizarre turn of events that involved Charlie Sheen, of all people, it had the Guinea Pig series being investigated by the FBI. In 1991, actor Charlie Sheen was given a copy of the second film in the series, Flowers of Flesh and Blood, and after watching it, Sheen mistook it for a genuine snuff film, claiming that the graphic depictions on screen were so lifelike that there was no way special effects could have pulled it off. He was so convinced that he contacted the FBI to report it, only to find that they were in fact already investigating the filmmakers, who were then summoned to a Japanese court to prove that the special effects were fake. Must have been all of that tiger blood. Next up at number 2, Snuff, 1976.
Ladies and gentlemen, the bloodiest thing that ever happened in front of a camera. Snuff.
And much like August Underground, the creators of Snuff actually made this film with the intention of convincing people that it was real, in what proved to be one of the most calamitous and opportunistic turns of events in horror history. In 1971, notorious grindhouse husband and wife duo Michael and Roberta Finley had made a low-budget exploitation film known as Slaughter, filmed in Argentina on a budget of $30,000. And, well, obviously it was terrible and suffered a string of limited releases until it was picked up by Alan Shackleton, an independent low-budget film distributor, where he kept it in his archive for 4 years. Until 1976, when the urban legend of snuff cinema was at its highest peak and Shackleton figured he could cash in. He later retitled it Snuff, as well as refilming the entire ending, this time depicting what appeared to be a real murder after the filmmakers had supposedly finished rolling. The audience saw the crew members brutally murder the film's lead actress before cutting to black and removing the film's credits. To add insult, it was also marketed with the tagline, "The film that could only be made in South America, where life is cheap. And well, it worked. The public genuinely believed that it was a snuff movie and contained video evidence of a murder. So much so that Shackleton and crew were investigated by the District Attorney of New York, who wasn't appeased until he actually saw the lead actress alive and well. Obviously she was alive, but still, I'd consider that a pretty close call. Written and directed by Argentinian horror aficionado Demian Rugna, this film was first released under its Argentinian title of Aterrados and later under its English name of Terrified. And, well, it kind of does what it says on the tin, because if you're in the business for checking under your bed for ghouls and monsters, then that's exactly what you'll get here. I will admit I did have a few gripes with this film, mainly due to its lack of pacing. It takes a hot minute to get to the point and then it's just a kind of non-stop barrage, but I will also note that that's exactly where its strengths lie. The film focuses on a group of paranormal investigators trying to discover the mystery of a haunted house in a neighborhood of Buenos Aires, and while it's wrapped up neatly as a classic haunted house story, it also becomes so much more than that. Clearly this film was made by fans of horror cinema and it pulls out pretty much every trick in the book, but it's also gleaned with an absolutely terrifying eye for horror. Terrified will make your skin crawl, and if you've got a smidgen of morbid humour, you'll probably find parts of this film hilarious too. Coming in next at number 4, The Burrowers, 2008.
Why would they bury her alive? I don't know.
And no, not The Borrowers starring John Goodman, because that would be a whole different level of spooky. Now, I might be biased because I love westerns, and 2008's The Borrowers is, well, a horror set in the Wild West, which granted might put you off from the beginning, but as far as period piece horror mashups go, this one's probably at the top of the pile. It's difficult to balance a politically relevant western period drama with a classic horror creature feature, but that's exactly where J.T. Petty's The Burrowers shines. The film focuses on a group of pioneers in 1879 who venture through the Dakota territories trying to build a new life during the flood of western settlers. If you're a fan of the early noughties, The Burrowers has a cast jam-packed of genre actors who never really had their time to shine, but really get their chance to here. William Mapother, Laura Layton, Sean Patrick Thomas, and the unstoppable juggernaut that is Clancy Brown. Also, the most important point to note in The Burrowers is that the monsters are absolutely awesome, and as far as creature feature goes, this one delivers it in spades. Next up at number 3, Possum, 2018. And now we're really talking. My word, this film is creepy. Now, let's segue things, because as a Brit, I've got to make a note that we do bleak, atmospheric isolation really, really well in cinema. It's our thing, you know? It's always raining, the sky is grey most of the time, and it has historically reflected so in film. Well, Possum is exactly that. And if you're not in the game of feeling deeply unsettled, I'd avoid this film, because I warn you, it's going to stick with you. Also, it was written and directed by the trailblazing Matthew Holness, who also made one of the greatest and weirdest British comedies ever, Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. Possum covers some tough themes, which bleed throughout the plot in a kind of atmospheric oppression. It stars Sean Harris, a fantastic British actor who plays the part of Philip, a disgraced children's puppeteer trying to piece his life back together while also confronting the demons of his past. And also, if you have a fear of the uncanny, puppets, mannequins, whatever, Possum will make you feel very, very scared. I don't want to ruin anything, but it has one of the most unsettling scenes I've seen in quite a while. You'll know it when you see it. Give it a watch. Swinging in at number 2, Ghost Stories, 2018. Now, I know for certain that if you guys haven't yet seen 2018's Ghost Stories, then you will absolutely love it. Who would have guessed that one of the smartest horror movies of 2018 would have Martin Freeman in a supporting role? Eh? Not me. But yet, here we have it, written and directed by the awesome British duo Andy Nyman and Jeremy Dyson. Ghost Stories is based on the duo's 2010 stage play of the same name. It follows the story of Philip Goodman, played by Nyman, a famous television professor renowned for debunking psychics and paranormal events. What plays out out of 3 separate ghost stories intended to make a believer out of Goodman, and that's just the beginning. It's kind of reminiscent of The Twilight Zone and Tales from the Crypt, and if you're a fan of anthology horror, then you'll definitely be a fan of ghost stories. Although the intelligence of this film relies on its ability to wrap the whole thing up, and it more than delivers so in its final act. The most important thing to note about ghost stories is that it's fun. It's an entertaining film, and it never lets up with the creepy, crawling sense of British horror dread. Its cast is stacked: Martin Freeman, Paul Whitehouse, and Alex Lawther of Black Mirror fame. Yeah, maybe I'm overstamping the British horror vibe, but this film deserves to be up there with the best of the best. And finally, our number 1 spot, The Endless, 2018. Seriously now, horror fans, this film is incredible. And when I say incredible, I mean that it's one of the smartest, freshest, most inventive pieces of horror cinema I've seen in a long time. If you're a fan of the themes that we tend to cover here at Top 5 Scary Videos, Lovecraftian literature, cosmic horror, the weird, perplexing realm of the occult and its mysteries, then you will find a home with The Endless. I will also go so far as to say this film is a horror masterpiece. There, we have it. The cat's out the bag. Written and directed by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, who also star in the film and so comprise the believable framing device that makes up the first curious steps into the film's increasingly bizarre plot. More than any film we featured on these lists, I don't want to spoil anything whatsoever with this film, so we'll leave it at that. But trust me, you'll have to watch it several times before you fully absorb its uneasy, perplexing nature. This film starts small and heads out into one of the most expansive journeys that horror cinema has been on in quite some time. And the whole thing was made on a shoestring budget. It just goes to show that with drive, originality, and boundless creativity can make a truly worthy horror film. Number 5.
I said listen to me.
I think everyone's dead.
Pontypool. And really, the fact that Bruce McDonald's horror tour de force isn't heralded as one of the greatest zombie films ever made is a bit of an injustice. I say zombie film because that's the closest we'll ever get to understanding whatever virus plagues the unassuming town of Pontypool. Released in 2008, this Canadian horror film was based on the Tony Burgess novel Pontypool Changes Everything, the story of an Ontario-based radio station that tries its hardest to keep broadcasting during a viral apocalyptic event. It follows the character of Grant Mazzy, played by the awesome Stephen McHattie, an opinionated and brash radio jockey that tries his damnedest to be as dismissive as possible when facing down the end of the world. While I might not have you hooked by saying this is essentially a horror film about the English language, the real reason to watch this film is because Pontypool is a completely different breed of zombie flick. In parts, it's hilarious, in others, it's horrifying. If you haven't seen it, give it a watch, you won't be disappointed. Coming in at number 4, Kill List.
On them Christian soldiers,
Giving me indigestion.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Apology accepted.
The term folk horror isn't as commonplace as it should be in horror cinema, but it's a style that has slowly germinated in British cinema and is captured perfectly in the sweeping action horror from the fantastic Ben Wheatley Kill List. This film draws inspiration from some 70s horror classics such as The Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and of course, The Wicker Man, in a period where, to be honest, British horror cinema had hit its peak. Now, I'll admit that this film isn't for everyone. It's intentionally ambiguous and visually misleading, but if the idea of deranged cults flocking about in huge country manors makes your skin crawl, then you'll find true fear in this film. Really, because it delivers that in spades. Kill List features the show-stealing Neil Maskell, a disgustingly underrated actor who plays an ex-soldier turned contract killer trying to make enough money to support his family in one final job. I don't want to spoil anything because Kill List really does keep you guessing all the way to the end, but the way it takes you there is what makes this film so damn thrilling. Give it a watch. Next up at number 3, the Poughkeepsie Tapes.
When people think of serial killers, they think of 4 or 5 people, you know, Ted Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy, etc. But what most people don't realize is how many more there are.
An interesting film, to say the least. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of found footage horror, and to be honest, I'm not even the biggest fan of gore for the sake of gore and shock horror cinema. However, there is one exception, and I also think that this film gets unjustly labelled as torture porn because it's fundamentally not. It's a documentary about a serial killer and a twisted insight into the mind of a fictional mass murderer, captured over 800 neatly organised videotapes dubbed the Poughkeepsie tapes. Written and directed by John Eric Dowdle, this film was pretty much shelved by MGM and never actually made it to mass distribution, which is the reason why it went underneath most people's radar. And it's kind of been a thorn in the side of horror cinema for quite a while, receiving scathing reviews from critics. For fans of horror cinema though, the Poughkeepsie tapes is worth a watch, simply because it's so fresh in its concept, and it's a form that we rarely get to see done correctly in the genre. Also, it's really, really messed up. Swinging in at number 2, Eden Lake.
I'm not looking at a face page, I'm looking at a tip.
She's a lovely
As far as British horror cinema goes, from one Brit to the wider world, I really can't recommend this film enough. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it, because for a movie with an incredibly simple, straightforward plot, Eden Lake really makes you care about the consequences of its final outcome. And that, in essence, is what makes it so horrifying, because the consequences are really, really rough. Also, it's got a youngish Michael Fassbender, so there's that. Released in 2008 and written and directed by James Watkins, Eden Lake tells a story of schoolteacher Jenny and her boyfriend Steve, played by Fassbender, as they take a quiet little vacation into the English countryside. Unfortunately for them though, there's a bunch of teenagers, and as we all know in horror cinema, one of those kids is bound to be a sociopath. Again, I don't want to spoil anything, so I'll leave it at that, but Eden Lake deals with some visceral themes, and the bleak level of violence creeps up on you quicker than a rabid Rottweiler. Definitely one that every horror fan needs in their repertoire. And finally, at our number 1 spot, The Autopsy of Jane Doe.
When we start something, we finish it. You wanna leave? Leave.
Going into this film, I had zero expectations, and considering it was pretty much a direct-to-Netflix feature, I was completely blown away by how damn good of a horror flick it is. I know I say this time and time again, but the difference between a well-made, well-handled, slow, supernatural horror compared to that of a gore fest patched together with some cheap tricks and CGI is massively important to the horror genre as a whole. Well, director Andrew Overdahl definitely delivered on that benchmark, stating that he wanted to prove he could do more than found footage style horror after his critical success with Troll Hunter, which, if you haven't seen that either, see it, it's awesome. 2 for 1. The Autopsy of Jane Doe is the story of a mysterious corpse and the slow unravelling of the causes of her death by father-son mortician duo Austin and Tommy Tilden, played by Emil Hirsch and the awesome Brian Cox respectively. This film also handles the paranormal in a very responsible manner. We're never expected to believe anything that isn't already alluded to in the film's plot. In essence, this is a very, very smart film. It's claustrophobic in all the right ways, it's disturbing and elegant, and it's a modern diamond in the rough for the genre. Honestly, give it a watch. Kicking off at number 5, The Hallow. As you may know, I'm a huge proponent for British horror, mainly because the only thing we've really got to do over there is look out at a grey sky through a rainy window, and, well, it makes for some pretty terrifying horror cinema. No more so than in 2016's The Hallow, written and directed by Corin Hardy, the man recently responsible for The Nun. Also, if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, then this film stars both Joseph Maul, aka Benjen Stark, and Michael McElhatton, aka the brilliantly morose Roose Bolton. Great stuff. The Hallow plays out as a folklore tale of old, a family from the city, a newborn baby, and a malevolent creature out in the deep dark wood with strange twisted intentions. It's also a breath of fresh air from the cookie cutter creature feature that we see in modern cinema, and the departure from full-blown CGI, with instead using old school practical effects, make for some terrifying on-screen moments, bringing creatures from Irish folklore to a nightmarish reality. It's great, give it a watch. Coming in at number 4, The Omen. geez, this film. Admittedly, as I get older, the impact of The Omen becomes less and less, but there's no denying that Damien Thorne, aka the Antichrist himself, is one of the most demonically fear-inducing kids to have ever stepped on screen, and the first time you see his twisty little smile is something that you'll never forget. Here is wisdom, let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Pretty metal, right? Well, in essence, that's what Richard Donner's 1976 on-screen demonic onslaught really is. It's a religiously charged, meandering tale that drags us along through the hallways of hell on Earth. Now, I'm talking of the wider franchise in this case because the original film starring Gregory Peck is a much more subtle and creepingly quiet beast. The strange, spacious audio track, the wide lingering shots, and an absolutely terrifying performance from a 4-year-old boy, Harvey Spencer Stevens. I wouldn't necessarily advocate saying a prayer before you watch this film, but I wouldn't tell you not to either. Swinging in at number 3, The Wailing. Oh man, is this film good. South Korean cinema just can't seem to make a bad horror film, and at the top of that pile is The Wailing, written and directed by Na Hong Jin. In essence, this film is about spiritual belief and the inner conflict of the soul. It weaves differing, competing threads of spiritualism throughout. Shamanism, ritualistic sacrifice, and even Christianity. Boiled down further, good and evil, angels and demons. Which one ends up on top? Well, if you watch the film, you'll find an answer of your own. What you will find, though, is an occult masterpiece into the weird world of Korean folklore. This film does a pretty stand-up job at keeping you on edge throughout its lengthy 2.5-hour runtime, feeding you tiny scraps of narrative right up until the very end. Also, we haven't even talked about the murder, demon, zombies, or the exorcism, or the cave scene. Yeah, I really don't want to ruin this film for you if you haven't seen it, but take it from me, it's worth the nightmares. Coming in next at number 2, The Babadook.
If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook.
Are you terrified of creepy shadow monsters that lurk behind your wardrobe door? Then please sit down in a dark room and watch The Babadook, a 2014 Australian psychological creature feature from Jennifer Kent. I say creature feature in the loosest sense because, guys, seriously, what the hell is The Babadook? I still don't know, and it's got me pretty shook. That, in essence, is the success of this film though, the fear of the unknown, the strange, otherworldly sense that you get as a child trying to fall asleep in a bleak, unfamiliar house. It blends the supernatural with the surreal, with a pinch of native Australian folklore to boot. Plus, also, if you're a fan of the kid fighting back against the monster, then you'll be thrilled at 6-year-old Samuel, played by Noah Wiseman, who absolutely steals the show. I appreciate that people have tried to find further meaning in this film's plot, its ending in particular, and while I think that there are wider cinematic elements that tie this film's plot together, without all of that, it's just a gut-wrenching, knees-weak, palm-sweaty kind of horror movie. You know, the best kind. It's a suspenseful, slightly off story about confronting the darkness that lies within. And finally, at our number 1 spot, The Witch. You know what? I get it if you don't like this film. I understand the criticism that it received, but let me tell you, you're wrong, because this film is possibly the most unnervingly, unexplainably, brilliantly strange piece of horror cinema of recent times. It ticks every box on my list, and I'll tell you why. This film is impossibly bleak. It plays like something forbidden, something that we just shouldn't be watching, a glimpse into the long forgotten world where the devil still reigns. It begins with the banishment of a New England family in the 16th century, where we briefly get a glimpse of colonial era society and a newly found North America. But that world is soon shut off, and all we're left with is the woods and the witch. Seriously, this film does so much with so little that it's testament to Robert Eggers, the director and writer, as this was his first debut film, and he's fastly becoming my favourite horror filmmaker, so keep your eye out on him. Again, I really don't want to spoil this film for you, but if you laugh at the idea of being terrified of a goat, then let me introduce you to Black Phillip.
Remove thy shift.